Kevin Robbins, CEO of Mid-Atlantic Employers Association, MEA, and welcome to our weekly town hall where we discuss different parts of business related to the new normal and what to be thinking about now, as well as a weekly update on all regulatory and compliance around COVID from an employer-employee perspective. So thank you for joining us today. We're glad you could join us. This is open to members and non-members as part of our support of the whole entire business community because we're all in this together. So appreciate you all joining us today. So today we are going to be discussing, kind of merger and acquisition considerations in post-COVID world. I'll introduce our speakers in just a minute. Go ahead, that's okay. Next week, we have an interesting topic. A lot of people are kind of working differently, both whether you're in an office or out of an office working for home. And, this is going to be a discussion on what are the tax issues or tax opportunities, both from an employer perspective, but really looking at the employee perspective in terms of if you are working in the city of Philadelphia, if you have expenses that relate to working from home. So we're pleased to be joined by two tax experts from Kreischer Miller next week. So be sure to join us for that one. We do have a couple of upcoming workshops and special events. On October 7th, we have our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Symposium, which is a 3.5-hour dedicated to these very important topics, and will provide a lot of ideas and thoughts to be thinking about as you explore your own organization and what you are doing and intend to do going forward. On October 30th, we have our Total Reward Summit, which is rescheduled from March, and here we'll look at trends for 2021, looking at employee benefits and health insurance, compensation, culture, what to be focused on with the virtual or kind of blended world we're now living in. So be sure to join us for that on the 30th. And then December 10th is our business trends event, which we're moving up from January. We are in the midst of doing our business trends survey right now. We will send a link out afterwards. This is about a 15-question survey. We'd appreciate everybody participating. We do this in conjunction with other employer associations around the country. So I think right now we have about 1,100 businesses participating, a very strong indicator of the mid-sized market. So hopefully you'll be able to provide it because we will publish both national as well as regional results. And on the 10th, will be Joel Naroff is a leading economist. He'll be giving his perception on 2021, which will obviously be impacted very much by the pandemic as well as the election results. And then Mike Trackman, who will be speaking just in a minute, will be talking about what to expect from compliance and regulatory matters as a result of the election. So it should be an interesting and informative session. And that will be a free event for members. And if you participate in the survey, we're also making that free for non-members. So again, please participate when you see the link today. Okay, next page. There's a little bit more information about our speakers for the diversity event. Next page. All right, so without further ado, let me turn it over to our speakers today. So we are going to be talking about buying and selling a business post-COVID world. It's going to be led by Mike Trackman, who is a partner with Whistler Pearlstein, and he's joined by John Derksen, who is the EVP for Univest, and we'll talk, kind of add in from a banking and financing perspective. And then, as always, Amy will wrap it up for us. So, Mike.
Thank you, Kevin. Good morning to everyone. It's good to be here again. Thanks also to John Derksen from Univest, who will add the lender's perspective to the topic that I want to address this morning, because I think it's very important to hear from the lending community as we address these issues. The reason why I'm making this presentation, and MEA has been kind enough to allow me to do that, is we've been seeing in our law firm a lot of activity, more so than what I expected, frankly, in terms of mergers and acquisitions in a COVID world. I think a lot of this has been driven by private equity. There's a lot of private equity groups out there, at least in our experience, that are looking for something to do with the money that they've assembled. There are troubled companies that are being pursued by bigger fish who are searching for bargains. There are consolidations out there. And in the context of representing clients over the last couple of months, as these events started to unfold, it became very apparent to us as lawyers that we're in a different world here. That so much of the rules of the game that seemingly applied in the past no longer apply. And I wanted to at least go through in a bullet point way what I think you need to be aware of and the cautions that you need to undertake. I'm going to try to limit what I have to say to about 15 minutes because of obvious time constraints. So excuse me if I go 3 miles wide and 6 inches deep, but my point is to acquaint you with things that you may need to research and obtain consultations on, as opposed to doing any sort of a deep dive into these issues. I want to give you the red flags and the trouble spots so that you'll be attuned to them should you be in this situation as either a prospective buyer or a prospective seller in the market. Next slide, please. So whether you're looking to sell or whether you're looking to buy, it's important to understand, as I've learned over the last couple of months, that what was normally the key components of a seller's due diligence program in determining whether they wanted to buy a target, and the key components in a buyer's preparation for due diligence, it's all different. I mean, the things that need to be focused on and the things that need to be considered, not all different. The fundamentals are still there, but there's a lot else that needs to be added. Key components of pricing and payment terms have to change, as I'll talk about in a second. Part of any merger and acquisition deal are the representations and warranties that the seller is required to make to the buyer, and that the buyer will generally demand from the seller. Those are the landscape for that has changed dramatically, and there's an awful lot of potential liabilities and risks that are involved upon the failure to analyze that in the COVID world. There are standard protective contract provisions that seem to work their way into the boilerplate of mergers and acquisitions. Many of them are no longer sufficient, no longer applicable, and others have worked their way into the landscape and need to be considered. So I'll try to go into some of the specifics on that, but it's just very important for you to understand that the landscape of due diligence, pricing, payment terms, representations, warranties, contract provisions, all of that has changed in a COVID world in some very significant ways. Next slide, please. So here are some things to be generally certain that you and your advisors, counsel, and CPAs generally review. Obviously, but not obviously enough in some contexts that I've seen, to what extent will COVID change the seller's business model? When you're in the market and you're trying to sell, you need to consider the extent to which COVID will change the way that prospective buyers are looking at you. And obviously, if you're a buyer, you need to consider these things. One of the key things, obviously, is the extent to which COVID has affected the seller's customer base. Historically, going back 2 years, 3 years, and looking at the numbers may not apply anymore in the COVID world. Strongly recommend that you check the sellers and the sellers' competitors in the market pricing trends for products and services, for example, since March. What might be a model that will carry forward into the future, but customer bases need to be looked at. What about the stability of, from a COVID perspective, of the seller's vendors, suppliers, key contractors, consultants, that sort of thing, to the extent that a target company is dependent upon certain vendors or contractors or consultants? Are those vendors, contractors, and consultants stable, or have they been damaged by COVID in a way that would affect the seller's business? And what about the extent to which future shutdowns, future remote work requirements will affect the revenue and the profit of a company that's considering offering itself on the market, or a buyer is thinking about acquiring? We know where we are now, but there's so much uncertainty and some Armageddon predictions for the winter that needs to be figured in terms of to what extent can the seller withstand the situation if there is, in fact, a future shutdown or remote work requirements really ramp up even beyond where they are now. Next slide. Similarly, if you are a buyer looking at a particular target, you're going to want to analyze whether COVID compliant policies and procedures were properly implemented. And if you're somebody who's thinking about being acquired, you want to establish those COVID compliant policies and procedures, because if you don't, you're trying to sell to a buyer a great unknown with respect to potential future liabilities, problems, and a huge burden for anybody who would acquire you in the effort to implement the policies and procedures that Amy talks about and we'll talk about every week. The percentage of the workforce that was on layoff and needs to be recalled, you want to look at whether a company that is being sold or a company that is being acquired will be able to restaff when they're able to do that. And you want to also, on the other end of that stick, you want to look to see whether a company is really up to speed with respect to the remote work capability and policy so that they can continue to operate depending upon the risks that COVID poses for all of us. Buyers and sellers are going to be very concerned about lease provisions. A company that is being considered for acquisition by a buyer, one of the first things we advise the prospective buyers to look at is what are the seller's lease provisions? Are they going to get stuck beyond a term and with terms that they can't abide in the event of a COVID issue? How flexible is the landlord? Do they have a line of communications open with the landlord? What's been the history of their ability to be flexible with the landlord? And then there is the potential for the new breed of COVID claims that needs to be analyzed. The claims by third parties who have been exposed to COVID in your workplace, workers who have been exposed to COVID in your workplace, paid leave issues that are coming up, ADA issues, discrimination issues that are now coming up as workers are being recalled from layoff. Who's being recalled? Who's been laid off? Is there any unlawful discrimination between the lines there? These are the things that both sellers who are thinking of being acquired and buyers who are thinking of acquiring need to review in a way that's much different than the pre-COVID era. Next slide, please. So there is in any merger or acquisition a debate that goes on between the buyer and the seller as to who is going to bear the risk of the post-closing possibilities of declines in business, for example, or loss of customers or revenue or profit losses. Who's going to bear those risks post-closing? In a COVID world, that's been amplified. Buyers want, sellers do not want longer-term payouts, holdbacks, price adjustments based upon what happens in the future. Buyers obviously want to hedge their bets with respect to the effect that COVID may have on a company that they're seeking to acquire. Sellers, obviously, on the other hand, want that off the table. They want a secure stream of payments. Their argument is, and in a negotiation, the argument of a seller would typically be, hey, I've already discounted my price as a result of COVID. You can't discount it twice. Pay me what you owe me based upon the pricing, but I can't both reduce my price and be responsible for later risks that I can't control. Buyers are going to want a whole different breed of warranties and representations that perhaps were on the table before, such as warranties and representations that a company they're acquiring has complied with CDC and OSHA requirements. Provisions that I'll talk about in a second with customers and suppliers, accounts receivable, whether cybersecurity issues have been resolved, the nature of insurance that might cover COVID-related problems. All of those things are being amplified right now. Sellers want provisions typically limited by language like this that, yeah, I'll make warranties and representations, but not with respect to things that happened from the pandemic because I can't control that. And as I said, I've already discounted my price. Enough is enough. Next slide. Some of the usual deal provisions that any of you who have been down this road before in terms of buying a company or selling a company, oftentimes between the execution of a term sheet pending the actual closing of a deal, you'll have a couple of provisions that are just looked past. They're just viewed as standard. They're boilerplate. They're nothing anybody even takes a second wave at. There will be no material adverse change in the business pending closing. So you sign a term sheet, you sign an agreement, there's some delay between that time and closing, no material adverse changes. Well, what about COVID? Will that apply to something that the selling business can't control, such as COVID? Now you've got a negotiation on your hands. There's also a typical provision that says that pending the closing, the seller will operate the company in the ordinary course of business. It's a routine provision. Of course, the seller will do that. But what if the seller is compelled to operate the business in a way that does not comply with the ordinary course based upon COVID? What happens then? Who bears those risks? these are things that need to be considered in the negotiation and in the deal document drafting itself. Next slide. There are potential PPP problems. I alliterated this as much as I could. There were a couple other P words that I wanted to work into here, but good taste prevailed for once. There is a restriction on the right, in most cases, there is a restriction on the right of a PPP borrower, if you have a PPP loan, to sell before forgiveness or repayment of the loan. So if you are in the business of either buying a company or selling your company, and the company that's being sold has an outstanding PPP loan, there may be restrictions. You'll need to check the promissory note that you signed with the lender. This goes back to certain obligations that lenders have with the SBA. I don't want to get too far into the weeds now, but just know that if you have an outstanding PPP loan that has not as yet been repaid or forgiven, there are issues that need to be confronted before you can consummate a sale. There's some workarounds possibly, but you've got to confront that issue. If you do obtain approval for the sale and you're on the buying side, assess the forgiveness likelihood, obviously, but more importantly, you've got a lot of situations where companies have had their ability to stay in business and to prosper inflated somewhat, perhaps beyond the normal reality by virtue of the fact that they received the PPP loan in 2020. Nobody knows what's going to happen in 2021 in respect to whether or not there will be continuing sources of support for companies as there were with respect to PPP loans. And so as either the buyer contemplating the transaction or the seller dealing with pricing negotiations and the like, how will you justify a reality in 2021 unsupported by something like a PPP loan? And can you judge pricing and valuation on the basis of 2020 where a company was supported by a PPP loan? Again, these are new issues that are going to have to be evaluated in the course of these transactions. Next slide, please. By the way, it's worth noting, I can't vouch for the accuracy of this, but I saw from a respected media outlet as I was perusing things this morning that as of now, not one PPP loan across the country has been forgiven. So I don't know what that holds for the future and what the timing is going to be with respect to all of that. Existing contract conundrums, and by that I mean, for example, if you've got a seller who has contracts with its customers, maybe it provides services, maybe it provides products, is there an out in those customer contracts in the event that the selling company is shut down by COVID? There are lawsuits being filed in respect to companies who have not been able to meet their commitments to customers. Products are delayed, products are not delivered, for example, because of COVID. And to the extent that there is not the so-called force majeure provision in a contract, although many of those force majeure provisions are drafted by boilerplate to exclude the effects of pandemic, you have potential liabilities. And if you are selling or if you are buying, you need to assess whether or not the company is going to be subject to claims by its customers if there is a COVID issue which forecloses its ability to honor obligations under contracts to customers. So word to the wise, you ought to have some look at your customer contracts as soon as possible, and to the extent that you're dealing with a standard form, change it to accommodate these risks. So too, the contracts that a selling company might have with its vendors, its contractors, its consultants, its suppliers, do those contractors and vendors and consultants have an out, or are they obligated to find a way to honor their obligations to the selling company due to COVID? If they have an out and they can bail on a selling company, that selling company could be damaged dramatically. Price goes down, buyers don't want you, etc. Sellers' loan agreements as well. Are the covenants at risk, more so than they would ordinarily be due to COVID? What's the nature of the relationship with the company's lender? Something that John Derksen is going to talk about in a minute. Next slide, please. It's also important to understand, and we're seeing an awful lot of this. I do need to stress this. In my capacity as a lawyer who typically represents privately held businesses, we're seeing a lot of the truism that desperate competitors do desperate things. And I think that anybody who is selling a company or anybody who's buying a company has to be extremely aware and start the preventive medicine, the course of legal vaccinations, if you will, that need to be administered now in order to secure these issues. These are crucial in non-COVID times. They're certainly crucial now as companies who are failing or troubled are looking to raid whatever they can from companies who are not as in a dire position. The easiest path to get out of trouble is to raid the success points of the companies who seem to be doing okay, and that is happening on an accelerated basis in my experience. So are your key employees secured? And I've stressed this in prior webinars that I presented. That doesn't just mean a boilerplate covenant not to compete. I believe that it's going to become more and more difficult to enforce the standard covenants not to compete that many businesses have utilized. And I think that you need to consider other methodologies, which are too far into the weeds for today's purposes, to secure your key employees from your competitors. Is your key intellectual property secured? Whether it's copyrights, patents, trademarks, whatever it is that constitutes your intellectual property, plans, process, has that been properly secured? Similarly, your secret sauce, if you will, that may not be protected by patent or copyright, but needs to be protected by secure, enforceable trade secrets and confidentiality agreements. Something I talked about in prior presentations, do you protect your trade secrets as trade secrets? Trade secrets is a term of art in the law. There's legislation that can provide you with tremendous leverage if someone tries to raid your so-called secret sauce. Not all that difficult to comply with, and you get a tremendous amount of ammunition to fend off and in fact recover damages from those who would try to take your trade secrets if you comply with those requirements. And also many other things could be added here, but remote work and cybersecurity has become a real issue. Cybersecurity by itself has become an amplified issue, and many of you have heard me talk about this in the past, pre-COVID. We've all read about the ransomware attacks that have happened, the hacking in terms of the acquisition of personal information that's being held for blackmail purposes, or the hacking of trade secrets and confidential information, etc. Cybersecurity has been a huge issue over the last several years. Now, with the increased advent of remote work, that connection between a remote worker and the company becomes an open portal for many companies to simply find their way through that, through whatever firewalls and cybersecurity protections you have, right into your company. Anybody who is selling a business, anybody who is buying a business is very well advised to take a look at whether or not the company that's being acquired is cybersecurity protected, given the advent and the increased nature, both now and in the future, of remote work and what that means for cybersecurity. All right, so within the time frame I have, those are the main bullet points that I'd like to talk about, and I'd like to bring John Derksen in, who's an executive vice president for commercial lending at Univest, which many of you are familiar with, because I thought it would be important to get a lender's perspective on these issues. Many of you have asked me how best to deal with lenders, how flexible are lenders, et cetera, and I thought John would be a great person to add for that benefit. John, welcome.
Thank you, Mike.
So first question that I just want to toss out and let you fly with this, John, is if someone is in the business of seeking to acquire another company and they're not backed by private equity, they're going and they're looking for a bank to fund the acquisition, how has the advent of COVID affected your decision-making, your assessment, how you deal with whether or not you will fund a company that's seeking to make an acquisition?
Sure, thank you. Well, again, appreciate the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here today. So as far as how has COVID impacted our decision-making and how we process applications for financing and everything, I guess the main thing is certainly a much more of a deeper dive, asking a lot more questions than we have in the past. And it all boils down to what is the predictability of the future revenue cash flow of the companies, right? That's ultimately how we're going to get repaid So now with the COVID having different impacts of COVID, we're now just diving more deep into how could this potentially impact the company. So one of the items, it's been commonly asked in the past, but even more so now, is supply chain. Supply chain is one of the first questions that we ask anymore. You know, do you have diversified sources of suppliers, vendors, just to make sure that you have other sources if for some reason someone's plant gets shut down for COVID, or maybe there's lack of supply? What's the domestic international mix as well? Are you completely reliant on international suppliers or not? So do you have the ability to get domestic suppliers? So supply chain has become a very common question now. A lot of things we didn't have to think about or ask about historically, we do. Also, you know, from a revenue stream standpoint, how diversified is your customer base? What flexibility do you have to change if for some reason one customer, their demand changes or certain product changes? You know, how diversified are your revenue streams and your product bases? Again, what I started with is how predictable is that cash flow right now? As you know, COVID started out as a 2 to 4 week shelter in place, and now this is something we're going to be dealing with for a while. How long, I don't know, but it's certainly going to be for a while. So really diving into the actual financials and the projections to understand the impact of COVID on the revenue. From a positive or negative standpoint, we have some customers that were struggling before COVID, and then COVID came along and they're busier now than they've ever been and very successful, and also just the opposite. So what are the long-term implications? Where will things settle? What are the consumer, the ultimate customers, where are their patterns going to settle in at? Because there will be some level of long-term change from a revenue standpoint. And the expenses, the same thing. So yes, your cleaning expenses, your PP&E expenses have gone up. We've also seen relatively recently over the last couple of months, costs for construction supplies. So if you're doing an addition, if you're expanding or building or anything, there's challenges with costs and availability from construction. Those costs have gone up, but then you also have travel and entertainment costs are down. There's a lot of different costs that are down, and more efficiencies are being recognized as well as people. For example, manufacturers, we're seeing where they've had multiple shifts. They're going to, some of them are going to longer work days as opposed to multiple shifts. They're creating efficiencies there, so they're lowering their costs. So diving into the details of the impact, the true impact of the COVID revenue and expenses, and making sure you understand what is the long-term implications there. The other thing that you touched on earlier, Mike, is key employees. So if we're looking at financing in the acquisition, and you've got a key employees involved, is making sure you know who they are and what the management depth is, that they really truly are locked in for the long haul. And I bring that up because we are seeing folks, the impact of COVID emotionally for folks has been really interesting. We've seen key people make career changes, or also maybe folks that were thinking of retiring 10 years down the line or 5 years down the line are deciding, you know what, enough's enough. I'm ready to retire maybe early. So just making sure that you have those key employees there. Again, having those key employees helps keep the revenue levels stable and makes that cash flow pretty predictable. As far as decision making from a collateral standpoint, certainly lenders are going to be a little bit more conservative on loan to values, as there can be some challenges understanding what is the values now in this new market. The highlights there, I will say that also the deals are taking longer. Everybody's doing more due diligence. The buyers, the sellers, the financing, everybody is doing more due diligence when it comes to the transaction. So it is taking longer to do the deals. But ultimately, good companies with solid balance sheets and cash flow, stable cash flow, backlog, management team, you know, they really aren't going to have issues finding the financing they need to pull the transaction off.
I thank you. I mean, one of the takeaways from this, I think, is that if you are thinking of setting your company up to sell, there are things that John touched upon and that I touched upon that can make you a more attractive target, so that, particularly if there's a financing contingency in a deal and a buyer is looking to finance the deal with a private bank, there are things that a prospective a company that is looking to be sold can do in terms of preparing itself to be more acceptable, more attractive now. And my point in this, and one of my points in doing this webinar, was to try and highlight from both a buyer's perspective and a seller's perspective. But right now, from a buyer's perspective, what can you do to make yourself a more attractive target and make it more likely that a seller would not only be willing, but would be able to finance a transaction in order to acquire you. Having said that, John, let me just toss out one more topic for you to discuss, and that is that I'm certainly aware of, and I know many of us are aware of the fact that companies are sometimes having difficulties, trouble in maintaining the relationships with their lenders. Companies who wish to survive long enough either to come out of this on the other end or to be acquired and for a fair price need to maintain themselves in business. And oftentimes that means that they need to secure and maintain a relationship with a lender who can work with them through these difficult times. And I would appreciate your perspective from those companies in that boat. How can they best secure favorable relationships with banks and other lenders?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I'll answer by just saying communication is huge. So just being open and communicate regularly with the bank, and I'm sure your bankers should be communicating regularly with you as well, and just staying in touch, keeping everybody up to date on how things are going. And if there are challenges, just let's just be honest, get things out on the table and work through the challenging situations. Your bankers know that certain specific industries that have been impacted by COVID, it's going to be challenging to hit covenants and that sort of thing. So the sooner you start working ahead and working through, hey, what is this true impact going to be on our company, the sooner the bank can work with you in order to try to help bridge the gap or help get through it. And whether it's to come out on the other side long-term independently or to try to help line up for a strategic buyer, there's no right or wrong approach there for sure. But your bank, typically the banks are going to want to take the approach of trying to work with our customers, especially during this difficult time. It's mutually beneficial, and that's certainly our approach. It's more difficult for businesses that would have been struggling before COVID, because if you're struggling before COVID, this makes it more challenging. There's some pre-existing fundamental weaknesses, but for the most part, if it's truly COVID related, you can identify it. You're making the adjustments. That's really important. And so some of our customers that have been hit a little bit harder, I mean, we're really diving in with them on help working through their revised budgets and everything. So working through the expenses, how are they adjusting them to adapt? Seen some really creative ways to try to really hunker down on the expenses as well as revenue. Folks have been changing their business models, realizing they're going to have lower revenues. So how can they deliver their product or service at a higher margin in order to be able to at least get back up to that break-even process? So I'm really diving into those projections and revised budgets and seeing how you can adapt in the business model. And also, hey, for us to work together, a lot of times we're rolling up our sleeves together, and maybe some of the owners have to personally put more capital in or additional collateral guarantees. But those are the sorts of things that you just try to work together and find things that work for everybody to get through a difficult situation.
Now, let me just underline that point, and then we'll wrap it up. I've been in situations recently where there are some companies who believe that the thing to do is to hide as much as they can from the bank for as long as they can, for fear that the bank is going to come in and pull the plug if the bank finds out what's going on. And I've been in situations where companies have forthrightly at the first possible time disclosed their situations to the bank and made an honest and sincere request that the bank work with them. The latter works a lot better than the former. I've been in situations where I've seen that, where the bank in the former situation says, we can't trust you. The kinds of flexibility that we would ordinarily provide is off the table because we no longer trust you. And we, you've got 3 months to leave. Others, I've even been in a situation where a bank has found a prospective buyer for from another customer on behalf of a company that was struggling and wanted to be acquired. So hiding the realities from the lender almost never works. And I have found in these times that lenders, particularly the smaller community banks or the banks like Univest as opposed to the major international banks, are really happy to try and work with the customers because they want to preserve a long-term relationship. It's not just for now, and you're a bigger fish in a smaller pond in that way, and the bank pays more attention to you. So I would, just from my experience, highly recommend full disclosure at the earliest possible time. All right, unless there's any questions or anything, John, thank you again very much. Kevin, thank you.
Yeah, hey, Mike, there is one question which I'll throw out to you guys, and that was great, very informative and definitely things to think about. We did have one question. A number of our members are ESOPs, and some have been thinking about it. And one question was, if somebody is in the process of considering an ESOP, is there any impact on financing that you see kind of with COVID, other than what you've talked about with any business?
Yeah, so from an acquisition standpoint, yeah, there's strategic acquisitions. There's where you turn over the next generation or key management, but ESOPs are a very viable option when it comes to selling the company or transitioning the ownership of the company. And it's still a viable option now. Again, it really gets back to what, and with ESOPs especially, it's what is the real predictability, the stable cash flow. As long as it makes sense and prove out the stability of the cash flow, ESOPs are and it meets the objectives of the direction the owners want to take and everything. The ESOPs are a very viable option. Now you're going to have probably not every lender is going to be able to know and understand and has gone through an ESOP transaction, but as long as you have the right professionals around you, your CPA firm is familiar with them, your law firm's familiar with how to work the ESOPs, and you have a banker that understands them. It's a very viable option, and we've seen a lot of success with that. So it's definitely something that folks should consider if it makes sense.
I think all the usual cautions apply that we've talked about before, but other than that, it's either viable or it's not from a business and a lender's perspective.
And the same valuation methodology is going to go into the pricing that you talked about with businesses in general. So,
and the same risks and the same representation and warranty issues and all of that. Yes, it's all the same. It's just a different type of buyer, but it's still a buy-sell transaction.
All right, so we do have one more question before we jump you guys off. Someone said if we do see a change in president, is there any need to consider accelerating an M&A transaction this year because of a tax increase?
I think I can say with no doubt of contradiction that I have no idea, and neither does anybody else.
We'll wait for you in December on that one, Mike.
That's right. That's right. It would be it would be irresponsible to speculate about that, because all we're getting now is electoral campaign noise. Well, and without knowing who controls Congress, who controls the Senate, and what happens after the election. Yeah, you can always hedge your bets a little, and it's a good thing to accelerate from that perspective, and that you remove the uncertainty. But in terms of predicting whether it would be good or bad in terms of what's going to happen later on, no one has any ideas to that.
Great. Well, again, thank you guys very much. With that, we're going to turn it over to Amy.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Kevin. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, John. Before I get started, one thing I wanted to let you all know about is if you have not visited our Coronavirus Resource Center, we encourage you to do so. It's open to members and non-members alike. We recently updated our FAQs, so please visit those. And I think we're going to send those out as part of our email after today's presentation. So something you may or may not have heard of, if you have employees in Philadelphia, Philadelphia recently amended its paid sick leave law to establish public health emergency leave. And the idea behind this is to try to touch some employees or some workers who may not be covered by the federal Families First Coronavirus Response Act. And so you get the Philadelphia leave for all of the same reasons you get under FFCRA, and I won't read these all. You by now hopefully have heard me talk about FFCRA enough. But the idea here is it's for employees and independent contractors. I think that's an important distinction who perform more than 40 hours of work per year in Philadelphia, okay? So if you have employees in Philly, and this could be people, keep in mind, who are working from home, right? Maybe your place of business is outside of the city, but you have employees who are working remotely from their homes in Philadelphia. Maybe they don't qualify for FFCRA, but maybe they do qualify under this new Philadelphia leave law. So if you have that situation going on, if you have workers in Philadelphia who are requesting time off, it may not be an automatic no because they don't qualify for FFCRA. Okay, and I thought this was really interesting. You've heard me talk for the last probably month at least about back to school and how that's sort of HR's nightmare, and it's the nightmare for a lot of employees who also happen to be parents of either school-age children or children who are younger and who are in daycare. So really interesting survey that I recently saw, and I wanted to share the results with you. It's a Catalyst CNBC survey of working parents in the U.S. Nearly 40% say their employer does not have enough benefits for parents to support them as their kids are engaged in virtual or hybrid learning. 57% are afraid that they're going to be the first group to go, or the first group negatively affected by employer decisions, should the employer make decisions about layoffs or cutbacks or moving people to part-time or furloughing. 41% they have less job security than pre-pandemic, and 38% they fear being penalized for being working parents. 41% of mothers, 36% of fathers said they have had to hide their caregiving struggles. They don't feel that they are able to come out to their employer and tell them what's going on with them so they can ask for help. 42% fear it will be a risk to their employment to take advantage of the child care offerings or benefits that are available to them. And 39% worry that if they will be terminated if they ask for help. So what does this say? It just says that your employees are struggling. Your employees who have school-age kids who have gone back to work are struggling. You need to be attuned to it because, as you've heard me say before, look, there may not be a way to accommodate everyone, but if you have spent time, energy, and money training a good employee and you want to keep them, it's worth it to try to figure this out now and to try to do whatever you can to work with these employees to try to get them help. So I think if anybody's listened to this webinar before has heard me say, you've got 3 real questions that you need to be asking yourself right now. Can we offer flexibility at work? That's flexibility around when and how the work gets done. Can we offer flexibility from work, leave, and time off? And can we help with the caregiving? Can we subsidize care? Can we give access to caregiving resources? So I just read a really interesting article about some examples out there, real life examples. And I get it. These are big companies that may have access to more resources than you do. But it's just some ideas to think about. And I think this first one, is something we all can do, right, as employers. Paylocity, the employees work with their managers to set up a schedule that best meets their work-life needs, including early hours, late hours, and split schedules. So I get it. If you have employees who need to be in person and they're beholden to a shift because what they do affects what everybody else does, this doesn't work. But if you have employees working remotely, if you have employees who have some flexibility in how the work gets done and when the work gets done, it's a great idea. Have your managers meet separately with each employee and say, what's your pain point, right? What part of the day do you need to be most accessible to your family? Or what part of the day can you give us at work? And maybe we can find out a schedule that works for both of us. And then another, again, huge employers, I get it. But what can you do about flexibility from work? Microsoft employees received an additional 12 weeks of paid parental leave earlier this year. Google extended family leave to 14 weeks for workers to care for families during the pandemic back in April. And again, this may not even be enough, right? Because a lot of employees burned through their time, whether it was under FFCRA or time like this, they burned through that back in March when schools were shut down. And now they're facing a situation where hybrid learning or distance learning is going on again. And then how about caregiving programs? Again, really interesting. Software developer Globant provides virtual activities for kids of their employees. So art shows, movement breaks, magic shows, things that run by outside professionals on Zoom for employees. So the employee, maybe they can work side by side with the kids, right? The kids can be on their Zoom doing an art project with a professional while the employee is next to them getting work done. Another example around that, Toyota Again, I get it, a huge employer. Not a lot of employers have the means to do this, but just an idea. They created an on-site program at one of their Kentucky manufacturing plants, supervising elementary school-age children with remote learning, including aftercare. So the kids can go to this program at the plant. They can be supervised in their distance learning while the employees are being productive making cars. Okay, so just some ideas, plant some seeds for you, get you talking. You also saw in the last couple of weeks, CDC has changed their recommendations around testing for individuals, both with and without COVID symptoms. So these are the current guidelines. And again, you guys have heard me say this before. Spend some time on the CDC's website every week. Stuff is changing. They have great information there. So if you have an employee with mild symptoms, they should consult with their healthcare provider regarding testing. If they have a positive test or no test, this is the routine that they should go into: self-isolate for at least 10 days after symptom onset, and resolution of fever for at least 24 hours without the use of fever-reducing medication, and improvement of other symptoms. Negative test is not required to return to work or school as long as there was no hospitalization, and again, there's been at least 10 days after symptom onset and the resolution of fever for at least 24 hours without using aspirin, Tylenol, ibuprofen, etc. And then testing for individuals with no symptoms but exposure. The recommendation is that these folks, and when we say close contact, we mean within 6 feet for at least 15 minutes of someone with a known or suspected case. They should be tested, self-quarantine or isolate while you're waiting for results. Even with a negative test, self-isolate for 14 days because of a couple of reasons. One, we know there are false negatives out there, but also you could have tested too soon before the test will become positive. Self-isolation is not possible. Talking about maybe a critical infrastructure worker, wear a mask, physically distance, avoid crowds. You've heard it all before, right? Okay, and then a question that has come up more and more, so I've covered this the last few weeks, but it bears repeating again. What should we be doing about flu shots? What about a COVID vaccine when it becomes available? So under the Americans with Disabilities Act, employers can establish legitimate health and safety requirements that are job-related and consistent with business necessity. We've seen this in healthcare for years and years. Generally speaking, flu shots have been required. Sometimes some healthcare outlets have an exception for workers for ADA, a disability or condition. Some have exceptions for religious reasons, and there's been litigation over this. For the most part, the healthcare companies, organizations can require the flu shots. Might be less so, depending on what type of organization you have and depending on, are you in person or you're remote? It's pretty hard to say that your remote workers who are not coming back to an office anytime soon must have a flu shot for valid business reasons. But this is something to think about. And what I am saying right now to our members who have asked me, should we require the flu shot? Kind of saying, well, what if people refuse? What if you say we're mandating the flu shot, but then people say, nope, not going to do it, and it's not for a disability, it's not for religious reasons. Are you as an employer prepared to terminate people over this requirement? So I think what might be better for employers is to educate your employees, explain to them how important it is to have a flu vaccine, maybe make it as easy for them as possible to get the flu vaccine. So we've seen all the pharmacy chains do flu clinics, and I think most of them have a 25-person requirement, but they will come to your workplace and they will do a clinic. I know for me, when I worked in a large law firm, that was the easiest way. If I could just walk into a conference room and have somebody give me a shot, I was going to get the flu vaccine every year, provided I was at work that day. It gets more complicated when you don't have that option presented to you. So make it as easy for your employees as possible. Maybe do a flu clinic. If you can't do a flu clinic, either because the logistics don't work or because you don't have 25 people enough to incent one of the big pharmacy chains to come out, how about give them an hour off of work time to go? Apparently it's very, very easy to get a flu shot. Haven't gotten mine yet, full disclosure, but I plan to. You make an appointment online at any one of the big pharmacy chains, you go in, you're in and out very quickly. So highly recommend that. And then one thing I did want to mention, and we'll take questions if there are any. I've had so many of you tell me so many members tell me how valuable they find membership at this time, how valuable they find these webinars at this time. And thank you, keep it coming. We love to hear that because it makes, it makes our job more rewarding to hear. But if you're finding value in membership, I wanted to make sure that you're all aware of our Refer a Peer Rewards program. If you refer another company, if you're a member, you refer another company and they join MEA, you will get 20% off your dues, your company will, but also you personally will get a $100 Amazon gift card. And that's stackable, that 20% off the dues is stackable. So if you refer 5 peer companies that all join, you're gonna get 100% off your dues, which is a pretty good deal. So again, remember that we have all this great stuff out there, some for members only and some for non-members as well. Please feel free to reach out to Hotline and Legal Services for any questions that you have. Kevin, do we have any questions?
No, somebody did mention that, and we posted it, but that's Rite Aid is waiving the 25%. So if you are interested in having someone come, you might want to check with Rite Aid. And again, I think you mentioned it, Amy, but it can include your family members to get to the 25. It's just 25 people. So, but I did get my shot, and it is super easy, especially if you do online booking, which CVS does. It takes about 5 minutes to go in. So definitely, this is a year to make sure you make that a priority. So, but no questions, Amy. Great job as always. And we wish everybody well. Look forward to seeing everybody next week. And as always with members, if anything came up today for questions, feel free to reach out to the hotline and legal support. And thanks very much and enjoy your day.
All right, thank you. Everybody have a great week.